Good morning, everyone. This infant attends your emergency department assessment unit ward. What's the first thing that goes through your head? Is it, woohoo, it's a baby, coo, cuddle? Or is it, oh crap, did you say they had a fever? Do you really mean they had a fever? Are you sure? You took it with a digital thermometer? Oh, please don't say fever, it means a septic screen, LP, it could be a bloody tap. Oh. So you may be on two sides of that particular spectrum. I'm not sure what else goes through your visceral reaction when you see young children, what information that you draw on. One of the things that is critical, I think, when we think about child health is the background information that we take. And one of the things, I've just realized I've not got one of the speakers, is that in 2019, I gave a talk at, don't forget the Bubbles 19 in the UK, and I started with this particular slide. It's a painting by Luc Fildes, turn of the century. It's called The Doctor. Has a triumvirate in it. There's the stereotypical white male doctor with a child at the front, and if you see at the back, there are two parents. And in that talk, I didn't actually talk about parents, professionals, or parents. I talked about process. I was talking about treatments and the evidence behind those treatments that we gave. This year, I want to concentrate on that triumvirate, and I want to talk about how it's great that parents and children might get good care, but only if they're the right type of children or parent. And it should be intuitive that when children come to hospital, that they need to be in hospital and that they get some form of intervention. And that intervention may just be reassurance, but that intervention comes with a professional. And you'd expect a parent, especially if you're admitted. The weird thing is that it wasn't until the 1960s in the UK that a parent was actually allowed to stay with their child while they were in hospital. And I remember speaking to my aunt, who got admitted for 10 days because she had mild scarlet fever and was taken away from her twin sister, my mum, and her own mother. And that's utterly horrendous, but that was only 50 to 60 years ago. Why did we let that happen? Okay? Children are empathic. Okay? Children know that they shouldn't be separated from their parents, but we as pediatricians decided that was the right thing to do. And part of the problem was that Freud, who clearly was a great psychologist, and another number of behavioralists decided that because little babies, all they did was just eat, all they needed to do was just eat and feed, and that you could just feed your child, put them down, and they didn't need any kind of parental love at all. And in fact, there's a chap called Luther Holt, who in 1900, about the time that painting was done, said, we need to break this vicious circle of picking up children when they cry. My God. And so how do we break that? Well, fortunately, a chap called Harry Harlow had read some work by a chap called John Bowlby, and he's the father of attachment theory. And he did some very, very controversial experiments. And there is a lot of debate about the ethics of this. But essentially, he took some monkeys, separated them from their mum, and gave them two choices. A wireframe monkey with a cotton sheath, like in this picture, and then also a similar monkey, but with a bit of milk attached. And just the baby monkeys were given a choice. And basically, the baby monkeys chose the warmth and comfort of this pseudo-mother. And that broke this theory that all babies were interested was feeding. And it sounds a bit horrific, but it needed that type of research to get the pattern report to say, look, this is horrendous. We shouldn't be taking families away from children when they're in hospital. And this attachment theory is really important. If you are stressed, you produce glucocorticoids. This isn't me talking some qualitative mumbo-jumbo. If you stress a child, their glucocorticoid levels go up, and if they are persistently high, it gives you poor long-term health outcomes. And what's fascinating is that there is this tiny window when you're born where you deliberately don't produce glucocorticoid. And what you do that because the mother takes care of all of your needs. At that point, and this has been demonstrated in a number of studies, while you don't have that glucocorticoid response, even if your mother is mean to you, you become attached to that particular frame of reference. And this is why so many children who are born up into abuse become attached to their abuser because their mechanism for protecting themselves is switched off. So there is a real stress around the process of how you interact with your parents. And I'm really, really labeling this point because stress in any form, whether that's from child protection cases, whether it's domestic abuse, or whether it's simple poverty, has an absolutely huge impact. There are 1.2 million children in Australia who live in poverty, children and young people. Poverty clearly increases your chance of being born at a low birth weight, being premature, or being stillborn. In the UK, if you follow trends of financial income over time and look at children and young persons' outcomes, there are 500 extra deaths per year just as a result of being born into poverty. If we raise people out of the poverty line, we would have less child death. So I want to ask you a question. When you see this infant or child in your practice, and I'd like you to put your hands up, how many of you are actively thinking about the socio-economic status of that family? Good. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for those of you who really put their hands up, because that was actually quite a challenging question, because of course some aspects of kind of poverty are obvious, and it's a bit of a grey area question. Yes, education links to poverty, your ability to communicate, your eloquence, etc. But the reason this is so vital is because I think it has a real bearing on the way that we do business. So I'm going to change tack quickly. I'm going to go back to just after COVID. And in the UK, we were watching what was happening in Australia with horror. As soon as people came out of lockdown, we had a huge wave of bronchiolitis. And you can see from the big peaks here, we've got 2018, 2019, 2020, bronchiolitis just completely disappears, and then it comes back at a relatively higher level, but spread out over a period of time, but in the summer months. And knowing that this has happened in Australia, we started a study called BronchStart, and we prospectively asked sites to start inputting data on children that they saw that they thought had bronchiolitis. We got over 60 sites involved, and we recruited over 17,000 infants less than 2 years of age. And you'll see from the scatter graph that not all sites recruited loads of patients. I will acknowledge there's a limitation. There is some bias in terms of where these children came from, but there were a lot of sites and there were a lot of patients. Now, this work is in a preprint, but just to share, and this is some of the earliest results that anyone in the world has seen so far, if you split down the age groups of these patients, as you would expect, there's a small group who are very young, there's a large majority of them who are under 1 year, and then we had in the UK about 30% of children with a bronchiolitic syndrome presenting between 1 and 2. Some of those were clearly viral wheeze, but that was a lot more than you'd normally expect, and that was typical of I suppose, this immunity debt type theory. Lots of children missed it during lockdown and got it afterwards. However, if you look back on previous years, those proportions were approximately the same as previous years. So this bronchiolitis wave may have been a bit bigger, it may have been a bit longer, but it was essentially the same as previous waves. So first key learning point is when we looked at the number of attendances from this, we found that the majority of children just presented once and then went away. But about 10% of children returned, and then a small proportion of those were admitted. But the key thing is, and I think we all know this, is actually bronchiolitis is a condition where you can to and fro, it waxes and wanes, and it is worth telling families that it's likely that we might see you again. In fact, I tell all our families now, 1 in 10 of children who come to the Leicester Royal Infirmary Children's Department will return at some point again, and I think that's useful information for the parents to know. If you look at the spread of where these children went, about 1%, and that's concurrent with other kind of data on this, go to ICU, proportion go to HDU, some are observed on wards, and the majority, about 2/3 to 3/4, go home. Okay, Damian, this is now getting a bit boring. I know all of this data. So this is the crux of the matter, though, is that we also recorded what's called the index of deprivation. Now, there is a limitation. This is based on postcode alone, but your postcode, where you live, matches significantly to the poverty level or the income that your family has. So an IMD centile of 1 is the lowest, i.e. the least income per household, of 5 is the highest. And the admissions, what we've done is that there's a confidence interval. These aren't, the number on the left is the raw number. The number in brackets is our guesstimate based on the birth cohort. You have more children born in the lower centiles, so you can't just say that the raw number of admissions are about the same. We've done a balancing act, basically, to take that into account. But what you'll see from this is that if you look at those going to PICU and HDU, something really stands out, okay? This is quite unexpected. You are more likely to go to HDU, but not ICU, if you are in a rich family. Okay, Damian, well, that's just random, chance. Okay, well, let's do an odds ratio and let's do a logistic regression. So even if you take into account the gestation of the child, what happened to them, their oxygen levels, and a bit of their physiology, what you find is your chance of going to HDU, not ICU, in fact, you've got more chance of going to ICU if you're in the lowest deprivation, but in the richest families are more likely to go to HDU. Why is that? Well, we don't know. If I look at raw numbers of those who ended up on high flow or CPAP, it's a much of a muchness. This was not a sicker cohort of patients. And that would have been really weird anyway, statistically. How would we have managed the most sick group from the richest families? That wouldn't have made any sense. So there is a conclusion that you have to start drawing here, is there is something about the placement or the decision making that we make as child health professionals against our most advantaged families. And this becomes increasingly more relevant if you look at other research about the modalities that we use for some children. For example, the Predict team have done some fantastic work showing that we quite like high flow now, and what we do is we give high flow to virtually everyone. And do we start then giving high flow to those families who perhaps are more eloquently expressing their concern for their child? And we know that high flow is more costly. And if you look, and this isn't a study of bronchiolitis, this is just children with respiratory distress. If you stick someone on high flow, they're likely to be in hospital for longer, okay? So there is something we are doing as pediatricians that is advantaging those families which are already advantaged. We are advantaging those families which are already advantaged. And this type of thinking is supported by other research. So in America, they looked at 910,000 visits of children with appendicitis. What happens if you look at who gets opioids between black and white families? Okay, that's quite stark. Now, the observant of you will say those confidence intervals cross. So it's not an absolute statistical difference, but I think those proportions tell a pretty clear story. More recent research, if you look at long bone fractures, okay, a lot of children do get analgesic. About half get opioids. Minority children are more likely actually to get analgesics. They're more likely to have their pain scores come down, but they're just much less likely to get that through opioids. we advantage the most advantaged in our society. So I just want you to think about the next time that you see a family, regardless of the age of the child, regardless of the research that you know exists about the treatment, and think about, why am I doing for this family what I wouldn't do for another family? Thank you very much for your time.